I'm Shane Murphy-Goldsmith, President and CEO of Liberty Hill Foundation. I want to thank you all for joining us today for our funder briefing on criminal justice during COVID-19, de-incarceration and re-entry. I also want to give a huge thank you to all of our co-hosts from the California Funders for Boys and Men of Color, Executive Alliance, Justice Funders, and the Congressional Black Caucus for making this virtual event possible. I know there are lots of members of the Liberty Hill community out there joining us today, our foundation partners, individual donors, community partners, and others. I'm so glad you've joined us today. For those of you who may not know, at Liberty Hill, we believe the people closest to the problems need to be the ones to fight for change, and we need to follow their lead. We are a public foundation, so we raise funds and give them out to community organizers, advocates, and others building power and winning social change. Today's event was originally designed, as I said, before this powerful uprising to focus on decarceration during COVID and the need for ongoing organizing as well as direct services for people released from lockup during COVID. This continues to be vitally important, and this is the primary focus of our discussion today. However, given the incredible movement sweeping the nation, some of our panelists will share their views on defunding the police and how we reimagine policing and end police violence and racist policing. Thanks to powerful protests on the ground, we have an unprecedented opportunity to reimagine our criminal justice system and the way we think about investing in our youth, our communities, and our future. Many of our grantee partners have long been working for decades on solutions to move funds from punishment to prevention and have been successful in shifting millions of dollars in public funds away from incarceration and punishment and criminalization and toward prevention, diversion, and development. We know the substantive and lasting change we seek will not be possible without powerful organizing led by the people directly impacted by these issues and allies, by supportive services provided by community-based organizations, as well as courageous action from government leaders and the support of the philanthropic community. At Liberty Hill, we continue to focus on investing in communities, not criminalization, and our energy will remain focused on the fight ahead and how we can best support communities directly impacted by systemic oppression to build power and win lasting change. We're excited to have two champions for justice with us today to discuss policy opportunities during this critical moment. Our featured speakers, Congressional Black Caucus Chair Karen Bass and former Liberty Hill board member, and also Representative Ayanna Presley. We're also going to hear about current needs on the ground from community leaders on the front lines of change, James Anderson, co-founder of the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, and Andrea James, founder and executive director of Families for Justice as Healing. Then we'll have an open discussion and outline some of the ways to contribute and get involved with this movement. Now, I have the wonderful pleasure of introducing Dr. Bob Ross, President and CEO of the California Endowment, a fierce leader in philanthropy around power building, racial justice, and closing youth prisons. Bob?
All right, thank you. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you, Shane, great colleague and friend and co-conspirator. Thank you, Greg Hodge, for the work you do in holding our hand at our organization on applying a racial justice, racial equity lens to our work at the California Endowment. And I'm thrilled to be with all of you today. And I just want to thank and make explicit my appreciation, Congressmember Bass, Congressmember Presley, for the way you push and fight and articulate and nudge and cajole and lead in the way you do. It's just incredibly inspiring to watch and see. So my comments, just hopefully to frame what we're going to hear today. And I'm imagining us sitting in this call, or maybe it's a conference by then, where we're in person, actually 10 years from now. And I'm imagining us having a conversation where we proudly look back on this moment where we collectively marshaled the spine, the energy, the courage to translate all of this hurt, all of this pain, all of this rage, all of this frustration, and all of this protest into meaningful, durable, transformative change in systems. And so as a foundation leader, I'm wondering, Shane, those of us who are privileged to be in these positions to have resources and try to strategically invest those resources, I'm imagining what is it that now we in philanthropy need to do differently or better to strengthen our ability and capacity to see the transformative change that we're on the cusp of right now. And so, you know, and those changes are in three areas. I mean, there's so much change needed, transformational change needed, that COVID-19 and the recent deaths at the hands of police have unmasked. But, you know, health for all certainly is one of them. Economic inclusion is another. But I would say that in the area of justice reform, there are three opportunities for serious, meaningful transformation, and not just reform at the margins, not just incrementalism. Obviously, in community safety and policing, we need to reimagine and redefine community safety, and imagine an entirely new way of communities and the public being safe and feeling safe and experiencing safety and peace in their community without having police as the driving leading edge of framing that, that definition of safety. So what is the new model that we need to be supporting and engaging and driving on? On youth incarceration, and this is why we fund advocacy and organizing the way that we do as a foundation. We have learned over the years from people named Karen Bass and the Liberty Hill Foundation the importance of investing in advocacy and organizing for change, because it was well more than a decade ago we began to hear from organizations like the Community Coalition, like the Youth Justice Coalition in South Central Los Angeles, that we could have a world without youth prisons. And maybe it sounded premature and a little crazy at the time. Well, you know, just give it all youth prisons, really? But that was the vision that those community leaders had. And Shane, to your point, that vision came from people who were closest to the problem, from young people who had been impacted by that system themselves, not from Rand, not from UCLA, not from Harvard, not from USC, but from organizations like the Community Coalition and the Youth Justice Coalition. And now we're on the cusp of closing. We are beginning to close youth prisons in the state of California and beginning to redeploy those assets in a powerful and meaningful way. So what does a community-based positive youth development system look like that replaces juvenile detention and juvenile incarceration? And on the adult side, we're beginning to see more substantial decarceration beginning to happen. COVID-19 has actually helped some of that. I chaired a commission for the County Board of Supervisors called the Alternatives to Incarceration Task Force. And we came up with an alternative model that is completely different than criminalizing public health issues. We need to move to a community-based public health system that recognizes that hurt people, and that most of the folks in prisons, women and men, have had substance abuse, mental health, trauma, those kinds of issues. So we need a public health model of replacing our current criminalized incarceration system. And we're beginning to see movement in that direction, but we need to double down on those efforts, double down on that advocacy, double down on that organizing, double down on that base building for folks who are in those fights, fighting those fights. And so I just hope we can look back some years from now and talk about a moment that is where outrage translated into transformative change that is meaningful and durable and lasts, and permanently reimagine city and county and state budgets, where you see much fewer dollars for incarceration and much increased dollars and enhanced dollars for positive youth development, mental health services, substance abuse services, and the kinds of help that folks need. So we're on the cusp of it. It is within our grasp, it is within our reach. each of us needs to take accountability for being a bit more bold, or maybe even a lot more bold. And the smartest thing we can do in philanthropy is continue to listen to folks who are the most impacted and closest to the issue and closest to the problems, and take their vision and invest in it and move it forward. And so that's where we're at. And let's lock down this date 10 years from now, Shane and Greg, and make sure we're having a celebratory moment about how proudly we responded to this transformative moment that we have. It's only a transformative moment if transformation happens, and we got to make sure that the work is getting done. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ross, and thank you to Shane and Greg for kicking us off. My name is Jenny Delwood, Executive Vice President at the Liberty Hill Foundation, and I have the distinct honor to introduce our two Congress members that are here with us today to begin our discussion. First up, I'll introduce Congresswoman Karen Bass, who is in her 5th term in Congress, representing Los Angeles and Culver City. And not only that, she obviously serves as the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, the chair of the Crime Subcommittee within the Judiciary Committee within Congress, and served as the first African-American woman speaker in this nation's history in the great state of California. She's also been a physician's assistant and many other titles, but most importantly, she is an organizer and has always been since her days in middle school all the way until now. She founded the Community Coalition in South Los Angeles in 1990, and ever since then has been on the national level fighting for justice and equity, continuing to mobilize and build power in communities. Now she just happens to have a seat in Congress on which to do that from. So I'd like to introduce Congresswoman Bass to share a few opening remarks with us.
Thank you very much, Jenny and Shane and Dr. Ross. And Dr. Ross, that was such an incredible opening. That was just a very beautiful vision, and I agree we are in this transformative moment, and it is on all of us to seize the time. But let me just thank Liberty Hill and the California Endowment I have worked with for many, many, many years. And it is so meaningful to organizers and activists around the country when we are supported by philanthropy, when philanthropy understands organizing and supports it, because that's really the only way for us to bring about the substantive change that we're talking about, because all of us on the call understands that real change that impacts folks that we are talking about, primarily low-income folks, typically folks of color, is when it is at the grassroots level. And then fundamentally, I believe the best change happens with an inside and an outside strategy. And Ayanna Presley and I, both members of Congress, have the privilege and opportunity to work on the inside, but we are very clear that our inside work cannot work without folks on the outside. And seeing all of the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people on the street now in this movement has been so inspiring for both of us. But let me just start with COVID, because that's where we started. And what happened when the pandemic first hit, I mean, you know, our world has just changed dramatically. It was like a bomb dropped and everything changed, and it seemed like it was overnight, and all of us have been on this journey, and none of us know when this journey is going to end or how it's going to end. But while we were on this journey from the congressional perspective, anytime you have an emergency like this, really what we do as members of Congress is take spaghetti and throw it on the wall, run and stick our finger in the dam and hope that it doesn't break, because you don't have time to really say what is happening, what is needed, what is going on. And so we passed the first couple of bills, but in the midst of us passing those bills, some of us were very concerned about folks who are incarcerated. I mean, when it first hit, I was like, oh my God, these people are sitting ducks. And everybody understands nursing homes, but our colleagues didn't really seem to get it when it came to people that were incarcerated. And so we were very concerned about that. And as the Congressional Black Caucus, this was even before we were aware of the extreme disproportionate death rate amongst Black folks and other folks of color. But we said we got to figure out what to do with folks that are incarcerated. So the Congressional Black Caucus at the beginning of the year, held an emergency summit. Now, this is before COVID. We had no idea what emergencies we would be facing this year. The emergency we felt was the 2020 election, and that if we did not get this election right in November, we were going to be a mess for literally the next 2 generations, because the strategy on the other side is to confirm judges, and specifically 40-year-old judges, so that they can be there for potentially 40 more years. So we were concerned about that. And then we were also concerned about the census. And the census, especially because the census is online this year, we felt that that was just a perfect way to make sure we were undercounted, our communities were undercounted. So we held an emergency summit, and we had planned to go around the country and have regional summits. Well, when COVID hit, we changed the strategy to having national town halls. And one of the town halls we did was we pulled together family members who had relatives that were incarcerated. And that was such an impactful experience that we decided to hold the same town hall again. And we've invited Speaker Pelosi and the other congressional leaders so that they could hear about the plight of people who were incarcerated. And we did that, again, because we were trying to get members of Congress to understand the significance of this population, and also that we needed to pass legislation to make the Bureau of Prisons release people. Why on earth would you have elderly inmates right now? Why would you have people incarcerated who had technical violations? Why would you have pregnant women and children? And we thought that we should move for people to be released, tested, released, treated inside for everybody. And so we did pass legislation that encouraged the BOP to release people, and of course they didn't. And so now we're trying to have legislation that requires the BOP to release people. And so we were hearing about the inconsistencies that were happening at that time. And so we were talking to people, gathering cases and hearing about what was going on. And we're still doing this in terms of how do we move forward with this situation. But you know, anytime you have a crisis, it's also an opportunity. And so we thought too, that as people were being released, as we were fighting on a federal level and we knew our counterparts were fighting on a state and a local level, it was an opportunity to experiment, if you will, with the idea of bail reform. Because why would you put somebody in jail now and if they can't make bail? And maybe down the line, we could also demonstrate that we released people and shocking, they actually showed up for their court appointment. There's no reason to keep people in jail for bail unless you're concerned about continuing violence or something like that, but never because somebody can't make their bail. So with all of that, you know, we passed several bills. Well, one of our bills provided tremendous resources for small businesses. Well, many of the advocates that were on the line that helped us pull together also were facing major hurdles, just like any other. A nonprofit is still a business, and they were not able to access the funds because one of our colleagues in the Senate insisted on putting a provision in the money that said if you were formerly incarcerated, if you had a conviction, you couldn't access the federal money. So with everything going on, we were really hoping that philanthropy, as often as the case, would step in and help these organizations, because as much as we tried on the federal level, we were not able to get that exemption. And then the perfect role that philanthropy always plays is, while we're trying to pass federal legislation, which you know can take 20 days or 20 years, that if philanthropic organizations stepped in, it would also serve the basis for us to fight for federal funding, with philanthropy demonstrating the change or the difference that could be made, that then those of us that are in Congress could look and say, you see the difference that was made? This is why we need to invest in this and put in private money. Put in public money. So that led to us wanting to have this phone call with philanthropy and with the advocates who are just right here on the front lines, helping us to come up with the best legislation. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the role that all of you play in supporting grassroots organizing that really brings about the kind of change that is needed in our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Bass. Next, I'll have the opportunity to introduce Congresswoman Ayanna Presley, who represents Massachusetts. This is her first term in Congress, but certainly not new to leadership and certainly an activist as well as at heart. She is the first woman of color to be elected in the state of Massachusetts to Congress. She has a really amazing background, someone who is close to her heart or her own personal experience. Her dad faced the criminal justice system and happened to be locked up during her childhood. Her mom is a tenant organizer, so she has activism in her blood. And fun fact, she was elected student body president of her 7th grade class all the way through her 12th grade class. So powerful woman from her childhood until now, Congresswoman Ayanna Presley.
Thank you. It's a good thing that you had me muted a moment ago, because I was over here being the amen corner for our chair and for my sister in service, Karen Bass. Appreciate you, so grateful always to have the opportunity to be in community with you, physically or virtually. So I want to thank our chair for always being a force for good and for justice. And I want to also thank, of course, Liberty Hill for, for being a part of this convening today, and everyone who's participating online, and Andrea James, one of my constituents, a powerful advocate for my home district, also joins us today. So I want to say thank you to Andrea. She has been a teacher to me in this work. I am a firm believer that the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power, driving and informing the policymaking. And that's so that we not only better understand the complexity and the nuances of the hurt, that we remain in proximity to it so we never grow complacent in our work, but it's also where we develop the best solutions in partnership with community. Many hands make for light work. So I'm grateful for Andrea James always extending her hand, Chairwoman Bass, and certainly to Liberty Hill. I would be remiss if I did not give a shout out to a speaker you'll hear from later on, who is not only a leader when it comes to dismantling systems of oppression and moving us towards a world focused on decarceration, liberation, and justice. He is also my handsome and wonderful husband, Mr. Conan Harris. So you'll be hearing from him shortly. Without a doubt, we find ourselves in unprecedented times, navigating a pandemic within a pandemic. We are weathering the COVID-19 crisis, which has disproportionately claimed the lives of Black and brown folks, and we are in a moment of public reckoning about the original pandemic in this nation, the only thing that COVID-19 couldn't kill, and that is racism. In this moment, it is so critical that we center the humanity and dignity of people, and again, that we ensure that those closest to the pain are driving and informing the policymaking. To Chairwoman Bass's point, the unprecedented times we find ourselves in, experiencing unprecedented hurt, require unprecedented organizing and mobilizing and activism. They require unprecedented legislating too. And so any commentary about people looking forward to our returning to normal is one that we must reject, because that normal, that status quo normal, was insufficient, unjust, and inadequate to begin with. Certainly for disproportionately low income and communities of color, and certainly for our incarcerated, our loved ones, our incarcerated neighbors and loved ones. So listen, you don't have to tell me that Black folks have been on the front lines of every moment of transformative change in this nation, and we're doing it again. This is activism that I grew up being exposed to. I did not have a mother who read me bedtime stories of nursery rhymes. Instead, she recited the speeches of Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm and told me stories of Black struggle, but also of Black liberation. And she made sure that I knew that as beautiful as my Blackness was, that I was born into a struggle, and that work would be a cradle to grave effort in order for us to realize our full emancipation. So your presence here today is a testament to your commitment to the work. So let's for a moment just unpack the work that lies ahead. In America, we have been precise, very targeted about the discriminatory policies and wealth distribution to white landowners since the very inception of our country. So in this moment, I need our anti-racist, justice-centered policy and resource allocations to be just as specific and to be just as precise. If you really believe that Black lives matter, then you know that we need to invest in Black folks. We need to pay Black folks. We need to center Black folks. We need to resource Black organizations. Philanthropy absolutely has a role to play in this work. Again, many hands make for lighter work. And I implore you to reflect on why we need philanthropy so desperately. That's not an indictment, but it is a history lesson. Again, the structural racism and deep inequities in America were created by man-made policies. Poverty, violence, redlining, and the war on drugs created these conditions. You control budgets, and with budgets comes power. This is a tipping point in our nation. We are seeing a cultural shift, but we won't be successful and justice will not be realized until we see a power shift. And that has everything to do with the shifting in our laws and also in our budgets. So today I ask you to think about how you are wielding that power that you have. I ask you to remain focused and action-oriented. And to the aspiring and racist, anti-racist accomplices tuning in who may be newer to this space, welcome. As I said a few days ago on Twitter, you posted Black Lives Matter on social media. Thank you for that. And now I'd like to see your budget. We need active partners in dismantling systems of oppression. The work of racial justice and equity must center police brutality, but we must also advance economic justice, education justice, healthcare justice. These issues are conflated and intersectional. The reason there is unrest in our streets is because there is unrest in our lives across every single issue. So again, thank you for your partnership today. Thank you for the work that you've already done. Thank you in advance for the work that you will do. And please do remain intersectional in your engagement and deliberate in your approach. And given the fact that I want to honor my mother in word and deed in everything that I do, and certainly my sister in service, our chair, Karen Bass, and my constituent, Andrea James, and my husband, who was raised by a proud Black woman, listen to, trust, and follow Black women.
Cool. Thank you, Congresswoman Presley, for a really powerful statement. I want to thank Congresswoman Bass, and as I was writing my notes around this sort of sisters Bass and Presley, powerful pairing. We now want to hear from two folks who have been on the front lines doing this work. Andrea James, who's the founder and executive director of Families for Justice and Healing, and James Anderson, who's the co-founder of the Anti-Recidivism Coalition based here in California. So I'm going to ask Andrea if you would talk about the work that you're doing in terms of sort of where you see the urgent needs, where the long-term strategy, as we laid this out, this sort of notion of what might things look like 10 years from now if we do our work well. But please, Andrea, you have the floor. And we actually take about 7 minutes or so. We'll hear from James, then we'll hear from Matt Cervantes from Sierra Health Foundation, who's going to give us a bit of a summary, and then we'll open this up for questions. So please, Sister James.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hodge. Thank you also to the Liberty Hill Foundation for inviting us into this space. I want to say thank you profusely to Congresswoman Bass, the chair, co-chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, our Congresswoman here in Massachusetts, Congresswoman Presley, for continuing to center the voices, the very important voices of women who are most directly affected by this criminal legal system, women and girls. I'm actually the founder of Families for Justice as Healing and the founder and currently executive director of the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. As incarcerated women in 2010, we heard an uptick in the dialogue about the need to end mass incarceration. We heard nothing about women, about our children, or about our communities that were struggling in our absence. The majority of incarcerated women are mothers, and they were the primary caretakers of their children prior to their incarceration. And we knew, as women sitting in a federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, that our voices and ideas needed to be heard. And we set upon a path to make that happen even as we were still in that prison. We know that a prison and the culture of incarceration will never be a place for a woman or girl to heal or advance her life. We began organizing ourselves inside of the federal prison again in Danbury, Connecticut, and we carried this work outside with us in 2011. After that, and over the years, we've spent a lot of time figuring out how are we going to operationalize this massive goal we have of ending incarceration of women and girls. Most recently, in the last 2 years, we moved around the country holding coalition meetings and town halls to get input from incarcerated women, formerly incarcerated women and their family members as to what are the needs of them, of their families, and of our communities. We asked ourselves the question then, how do we take all of this information and use it to figure out the plan to operationalize the massive goal again of ending incarceration of women and girls? And so we came out with this long-term work that we call reimagining communities. So neighborhood-led infrastructure and systems for community accountability, economic and personal development, all led by the most directly impacted women and girls who are leading organizing spaces around the country. They're working on participatory budgeting, participatory defense. They're addressing harm and violence from a community-led accountability structure. They're working on a national clemency project for women in state prisons. And they're working on developing community organizing training for formerly incarcerated women. And more importantly, a business startup model to increase economic development within our communities. We're finding increasingly, in addition to that, we have a conference every year, a national conference called the Free Her Conference. It's held in a different state every year. Last year, we took over 250 formerly incarcerated women through the EJI Legacy Museum experience, because we want our members to understand the history of slavery to mass incarceration. And that was an incredible opportunity. In addition to that, approximately about another 500 people attend that conference, and it's growing each year. But as we did this work to really get grounded in what the most directly affected people in those communities were saying is needed, economic development in the form of jobs, training, jobs, entrepreneurship opportunities, and worker-owned businesses was at the top of the list underneath all of the criminal legal reform system things and housing. Economic development was at the top of that list for what people living in communities most directly affected said that they need and want. I want to point out that even prior to COVID, Mr. Hodge, formerly incarcerated women, particularly Black formerly incarcerated women, are still last hired and first fired. Now more than ever, as a result of COVID-19, we need economic development, including training, entrepreneurship opportunities, and worker-owned businesses. I want to point out some interesting things that we're paying attention to right now, that 1.5 million Americans applied for unemployment just last week, 45 million in the last 13 weeks. Numbers like that don't bode well for formerly incarcerated women and their families. We believe that 85% of jobs will have to come from businesses that are close to communities, and those that will make intentional efforts to hire formerly incarcerated people. In addition to our community-led advocacy work, we are now building out an infrastructure to support formerly incarcerated women in starting businesses, being really well trained in how to run a business, doing that with full support from the National Council and from those partners that are helping us to develop, create economic development opportunities amongst our membership, and really saying to philanthropy that there's a huge opportunity here to help us to not only encourage business to hire formerly incarcerated women and others, but also to help us to create business opportunity where they are owning and leading their own businesses. Because as we know, for instance, as the National Council, we hire formerly incarcerated people. We provide health insurance for formerly incarcerated people. And businesses who are started by formerly incarcerated people do the same thing. And so particularly now, as I said, because of COVID-19, we're going to need significant investment in this area. And we're going to need business owners and other folks and partners to push on policy that preclude formerly incarcerated people and people with felony convictions from being able to take advantage of things such as the Paycheck Protection Program that got in the way of the very same businesses that are started and led for years by formerly incarcerated people, particularly in Black and brown communities, from being supported during the pandemic of COVID-19. So this is work that is evolving. We're excited about this work. We're excited to tell philanthropy about this work and to have conversations with folks who can help us to really create a platform for formerly incarcerated women to be leaders in this as we are coming out and the economy is reopening. But we know, and they want to, be leaders in developing their own businesses. They know it's going to be absolutely necessary in our communities.
Cool. Andrea, thank you so much for your comments. We're going to circle back to you in a few minutes with some questions. We want to hear from James Anderson, and then we do have a couple of questions for our congressional leaders. So James, if you would, about 7 minutes or so, what's your take on where the urgent needs are and the long-term strategies for doing this work?
Thank you. It's really incredible to be here with such an incredible group of individuals. Yeah, I do want to echo what Dr. Ross said. The focus and the vision of what was believed years ago was seen as radical, but now it seems practical, and I think that came at the cost of a lot of people suffering. So as we move forward, I do ask everyone to. It is those radical visions. It is those huge ideas that we need to focus on before they become practical, because I believe at that time a lot of damage has already been done to communities that need the support that we are here to offer. My name is James Anderson. For the last 8 years, I've worked in the criminal justice space. Growing up, I was born to a father who was half Korean, half Black. My mother was born in Mexico, immigrated to the US when she was 16 years old. And I was quickly exposed to an extremely volatile and abusive family environment at home that had to do with a lack of resources. But for the purpose of this call, I think what was important is the idea of race and how it plays with authority and power. I think some of my earliest memories of growing up were 12 years old, walking down the street or riding down the street on my scooter, and a police officer coming in an unmarked vehicle and flashing a strong light in my face, and then proceeding to follow me down half the block without saying anything. When I turned and I asked him, "Officer, is there something wrong?" He simply said, "What is your name?" I told him. He said, "You're an Anderson brother, great." And he sped off. Fast forward another year, I'm in junior high. I'm being brought into a back room to have my shirt taken off and pictures taken of me without any notice to my parents, without knowing what was happening. And soon in the next following years, I would find out that what they were doing was building a gang profile on me prior to even having any involvement in gangs that would later serve as a foundation for the sentencing that would be handed down to me. This continues all throughout my life of having my home continuously raided, having my mother, degraded in front of me with racial slurs because she couldn't speak English. And then fast forward into prison, where we all know this kind of systemic oppression and racism continues. But now we're focused on solutions. I went through this experience. I went through suffering and understanding what it's like to be on this ground floor of having these ladders stripped of you, these doors closed on you. But we have a critical moment in history to make a great impact. I started out in this work in the nonprofit sector with the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. At the time, doing something that was very revolutionary in its own right, and believing of giving people who are primarily system affected the power to come and speak and be the voice and the face of the movement. As we know, those who are closest to the problems, we hear again are closest to the solutions. I then realized that we needed to start to think outside the box to bring greater resources to the table. What we were doing was not enough. It was not bringing the results that we needed. I then transitioned about 3 years ago to start working into the corporate sector, the for-profit sector. And I joined a company called Guayaquil Yerba Mate. It's a yellow can. It's an organic caffeinated beverage, a very fast, quickly growing company. And being my traditional self, I wanted us to do something big. I wanted to convince leadership, if I was going to come on board, that we were going to make a radical impact in people's lives. Behold, we were able to make a commitment to give 10,000 jobs to people that were formerly incarcerated across the country and across the world. And this was a huge commitment on their end to really put some backbone behind it. And I wanted to really push them to be leaders in this space, a very unlikely partner. But suddenly I had this great opportunity, hundreds of jobs where we paid full healthcare, covered all the premiums for them and their families, provided them a 401k and a living wage. Hearing these beautiful stories of seeing people have their cars and their homes and finally be able to rebuild their lives, true equity, to really be able to rebuild. And suddenly there's multiple problems that I began to run into. I was so isolated to California that it was really the normal of what I was used to. But as I started to go across the country, my work, we hired people in 25 states, 49 cities, and across 3 countries. So it was quite extensive. And as I started to go to state, I finally felt excited. I had resources to provide, and a lot of them being able to quickly disperse millions of dollars worth of jobs to people who critically need them. And suddenly I ran into various issues. One huge problem was a lack of a network. I didn't realize that to this day, we do not have a centralized network of organizations across the country that are able to really tackle this problem in a cohesive manner. I think that sometimes we see this as a isolated issue that when we tackle these things solely focused on our states, but the problem is a connected network. And if we don't look at it as a connected problem, there's too many gaps where people are going to continue to fall through. I dropped into states like Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Texas, New York, Georgia. And the most frustrating part was having employment opportunities that I was in full control of to give to people and not being able to find individuals, going to these governmental organizations, these nonprofit organizations, and not having anyone that they could provide to take this employment opportunity. The other problem was finding someone that could take the employment opportunity, yet there was no training or any kind of preparation for these individuals to enter into the workforce. So it was really disheartening to see a lot of this happen. I think a big problem also was the absence of oversight in governmental programs. I can't tell you how many times I called a pro office for reentry, and I talked to everyone in that office trying to find someone to give a job, and many times they could not provide me with anyone, and their answers were these people are not prepared for this employment. At times they saw the salary and saw that it was equal to what they were making or more, and asked for the job themselves. So these are really the people we're putting in positions to try to provide the support to those coming home. I think there's a lack of investment in proven models. A lot of the problems we have, we know the solutions. We have programs around the country that do a very effective job at tackling them. We need to find a way to transition these models and share these models and proven strategies to these other states and other cities to provide this kind of support to individuals coming home from incarceration to succeed. I'm always a solution-based person, and my question is always, well, now what can we do? So I think first, a key element in all we're doing, I love that philanthropy is getting together. I love that government is getting together. These are 2 powerful forces that really have the power to make a substantial impact. But we have to tackle this issue as if we do not expect it to last forever. And trust me, I understand this. I worked at a company where we had to focus on revenue and keeping the lights on. We had to focus on budgets. But as foundations and people that are stakeholders that have power to put investments into the community, if we continue to allot a small percentage that will allow the lights in our buildings to stay on at the expense of people in communities, their lights being turned off, we're not truly approaching this problem in the right perspective. We have to tackle it as though we expect to eliminate it. And that means making radical investments in what we're doing and tackling this issue in various ways. We need to find strategic partners. The corporate sector really opened my eyes to the amount of money and wealth that we could truly transition back into these communities. But we need to understand how government and philanthropy can help to partner with these companies, help to provide opportunities and incentives to these companies, because sometimes it is that one door to provide open. I know personally from the company that I was working at, I now serve as a consultant role with them. A lot of markets, they needed just a little boost, a little encouragement that sometimes was in the form of wage replacement or, incentives for tax credits. And suddenly what was a small investment on behalf of government ended up becoming a huge investment on the behalf of the company. My brother now.
James, I'm gonna ask you to pause there because we're at a little bit at time, but we are going to circle back with some questions for you. So I'm going to ask Jenny if you would. You had a couple questions for our Congress folks.
Absolutely. So we've heard definitely inspired by James, by Andrea. We know across the country, while the federal government may not have taken up the charge to really reduce its prison population, we do know that that's happening throughout the country. In Los Angeles, our youth population in lockup dropped by 50% just in the last couple of years, and 30% of that was accelerated due to COVID. So we've seen a number of folks, adults and young people, being released. We also know that the protest movement has created an immense amount of pressure. Folks are calling for defunding the police, reform, restructure, fundamental change, and investment in our communities as opposed to continued punishment. So I'd love to hear from both of you, Congresswoman Presley and Bass. What do you see as the primary opportunities that we have to seize now and leverage this portal of opportunity to make significant change, both on the inside of government and on the outside? And what role do you see in particular for philanthropy that if we miss the boat on this, it's a shame on us? We'll start with Congresswoman Presley.
Okay. All right. I'm going to do my best to operate with brevity here because there's so much there in those questions. So, as I said, we do find ourselves at a tipping point, and we are seeing culture shift, but we want to see power shift. And so that has everything to do with how we legislate in this moment. So I see structural opportunities, I see policy opportunities, and I'm encouraged and I'm emboldened in this moment to really work to advance those. We have to catalyze this moment of public focus. So we have to shift the conversation away from one that is focused on minor reforms to a racist system. Now is really the time to educate people about this history and context and to offer an alternative vision. And that is something that I'd already done as a lawmaker. It's the People's Justice Guarantee, which centers 5 principles: shared power, freedom, human dignity, equality, and safety. I think we need a new framework to help us understand how we would design a criminal legal system, again, that actually centers the humanity and dignity of all. We also need to resource this movement, and we need to resource the organizations that know how to translate movement work into policy. We can never lose sight of the fact that, the organizing and the mobilization efforts, the protests and demonstrations that we see happening right now, that we're the beneficiaries of the early days of the civil rights movement, and all of that protesting and demonstrating. Birmingham was for 37 days. Freedom Rides were for 7 months. Greensboro was for 6 months. Montgomery's for 382 days. That was all about law change. So there's unrest in the streets because there's unrest in our lives, and we appreciate the solidarity of hashtags and likes and retweets. But the only receipts that I want to see right now are law change and in our budgets. And that's why we cannot stop applying that pressure and mobilizing until we see that. Now, because philanthropy is online, and because you helped to convene this, I want to speak directly to philanthropy. We need to invest in the leadership and entrepreneurship of formerly incarcerated individuals and family members who have been robbed of a loved one by police violence. They are uniquely positioned to lead community and programmatic efforts that are responsive to these crises. Urge the corporations or charitable families that fund your philanthropies to divest from private prisons. That would be game changing. A small portion of stakeholders control the majority of this country's wealth. So imagine what would happen if they divested from private prisons. It would create a massive shift. So I'll end there.
Great, thank you.
Let me jump in and mention, first of all, you see why I love serving with this woman? She is just a powerhouse. I know it must be strange to you to realize that folks like Representative Presley serve in Congress, but he does, and we're happy for it. So on the crime committee, I chair the crime committee in judiciary. And as soon as we move the policing bill, and next week, we passed it out of the House last night. We'll pass it off the floor next week. Did you go through that, Ayanna, because I stepped away for a minute?
Oh no, I didn't talk about Justice and Policing Act and the renaming of it in honor of George Floyd.
Okay, so that bill will go over to the Senate. Now, you know, that's with all Democratic votes. We're gonna have to see what happens in the Senate. If they pass something, then we'll be able to go into a conference committee. What I'm afraid of course, is that it just gets stuck. But I do think there is a strong reason why it wouldn't get stuck right now. And that's because obviously the president and the theater that he went through, which we all know is worthless, and then the bill that's being put forward in the Senate takes a lot of our categories but pulls the teeth out. And so that then, as weird as it might sound, provides a basis for negotiation. What has happened in the past is that the Republicans do absolutely nothing. They do absolutely nothing. They don't put any alternative, nothing. And so we do have a series of bills relating to criminal justice reform that we will pass out of the Judiciary Committee and off the floor. That's what happens when you have us in the majority. But I just can't emphasize enough. Right now, we need to have Democratic control of the Senate and the White House to get really the substance done that we need to have done. And so the legislation I've been working on specifically has focused on women in the criminal justice system, because in all of the discussions around reform, my brothers, I love them, but they really have been focused on men, not children, and not women. And so I have specific bills around that, and we're going to be gathering the criminal justice bills together. So we do see movement. We do have a moment. I do have my Republican colleagues calling me and coming to me and wanting to do legislation. They do that a lot, though, but then when the proof comes to the pudding, there's, you know, then they're scared. It all depends on whatever tweet is happening out of the White House. That is what governs my Republican colleagues right now. Trump's tweets. How pathetic is that?
So thank you, Congressman Bass, for raising the Justice and Policing Act and for your leadership there. I know there are many, we actually have almost 200 folks on the line today with us. Many of the foundations on the line have actually been supporting activists and organizers on the front lines calling for the defund movement, as well as those fighting for many reforms for many decades now. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you see the Justice and Policing Act as one step with this tension of folks calling for reform, for defunding and for radical change. How do you see the Justice and Policing Act in the continuum of the movement demands? And where do you see the work going from here?
Sure. Ayanna, do you, Representative Presley, would you like to take, I know you're going to have to jump off, but do you
I have to jump, but just really quickly, I'll just say that, you know, it's been very frustrating to see people try to co-opt and undermine the Black Lives Matter movement. As I've said, you know, throughout this, that, you know, our organizers honor a long history of community and movement building. We are community builders, not destroyers. And so first we saw folks infiltrating, seeking to undermine and to slow the progress of the Black Lives Matter movement. And now we see the defund movement being negatively co-opted. The defund movement is not new. Just yesterday, I posted a tweet in honor of Tupac's birthday. We got money for wars, but won't feed the poor. You know, the defund movement is not new. Activists have been on the ground mobilizing around this. The Congressional Black Caucus presents an alternative budget every year because we know that our communities have been under-resourced and underinvested in. And that's everything from the undercounting of the census to discriminatory and policies that have been targeted in our systemic oppression, you know, the impacts of structural racism. So the hurt and harm that has been disproportionately hoisted onto Black folks, it was legislated, it was targeted, it was precise. And so we need to be just as prescriptive. And that means in our lawmaking, but also in our budgets. And I'll just leave here with this. First responders have a role to play in society. However, they do not need to, nor do they want to, play a role in every part of society. I'm not going to, our mayors and our governors, you know, the chairwoman just laid out the realities of the dynamics of Washington in this moment. And that is no, we will never abdicate our responsibility to lead as a Congress, as a House, and to act as the conscience of this nation in this moment. But she talked about the realities of what we're up against there. Our governors and our mayors, with the stroke of a pen, they can effectuate real change. They can center Black lives, racial justice in their budgets. I was a municipal elected. I was a city council for 8 years. I voted down multiple budgets because I was not going to make the unjust choice between a paraprofessional, an accredited librarian, and a school nurse. And I certainly wasn't going to fund more school police when every child didn't have access to a school nurse or a social worker. Why are our police administering Narcan? They don't want to do that. We should be investing in substance use, on-demand treatment, culturally competent care. Why are law enforcement being deployed to someone's house when there's a mental health challenge? We have not talked about the number of Black lives of those who have been murdered, who are living with mental illness or living with disabilities, right? So why are we deploying law enforcement to the home of someone who is battling mental illness or living with a mental health challenge? We should be deploying mental health clinicians. So our first responders have a role to play in society, but they should not, nor do they want to play a role in every part of society. We know what works, we just refuse to fund it. So again, if you're gonna say Black Lives Matter, the only receipts I wanna see are in law change and in what you codify in your budgets. And so with that, I have to jump. Thank you. Defunding is about investment. Defunding the police is about investment in communities that have been under-resourced and divested in.
That's right.
Black folks. Thank you.
Thank you.
I gotta go.
Bye, sister.
Thank
you,
so
Madam
much.
Chair. Thank you.
All right, Greg, I'll pass it back to you.
Cool. Thank you, Jenny. Great job. What we're going to do now is hear from Matt Cervantes, who is at the Sierra Health Foundation, and give us a bit of a summary, if you will, Matt, what you've heard so far. And then we'll bring some questions forward that have been provided to us. If you have additional questions, you know, we have plenty, but feel free to put something in the chat box. If we can't get to it today, we should be able to respond to it in some way. So with that, Matt.
Thanks, Greg. And wow, it's just hard to follow this conversation in terms of being a speaker. Just powerhouse leadership, and just want to recognize all that's been shared to this point. You know, I will say this, that I have the honor and ability to work at Sierra Health Foundation. We're a proud co-founder of the California Funders for Boys and Men of Color, a statewide network of foundations with some of our colleagues on the line. Who are really leading and investing in change here in California to support the health and economic success of boys and young men of color in the state, working closely with our advocate partners at the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color and many other grassroots leaders. I will say, you know, in this work, and it won't be a surprise, we often hear the critique when we offer, you know, kind of, I don't know what to say, except offer alternatives to approaches, whether it's policing, mass incarceration, juvenile justice, criminal justice. We hear, well, what's the other model? What's your alternative? And I would just say that we've just had, you know, a pretty robust conversation about what the other model is. You know, the terms of economic justice, investing in communities that have been directly impacted. Healthcare for all that Dr. Ross mentioned. We know what the models are. We're just, as the Congresswoman pointed out, refusing to invest in those. So obviously philanthropy has a role. That's why we have nearly 200 people on this call. Philanthropy has a role to invest in the leadership development that we've heard about of those that are directly impacted, to help align those public investments to the values that we are talking about here today. I will say that the young people are very much leading this movement. You know, it is certainly intergenerational, but the solutions are certainly coming from the grassroots and, you know, helping shape the next policy solutions for the state of California. Dr. Ross really provided an important frame, and I think James underscored it. You know, the dreams and aspirations of those who have been directly impacted are often different than well-meaning public servants who are working within these systems. Folks that got into the work to do good. At the same time, the systems are very much broken. And if you talk to young people, family members directly impacted, you know there's a path to a different way. It's a matter of the investment, the political will, and the fortitude to follow through. It's not going to happen overnight. You know, there's a critique of the philanthropic sector. You know, 3-year grant cycles, and then we're off to the next thing. This is long-term work. And again, just appreciate the many partners that we have in this, the California Funders for Boys and Men of Color, the Executives Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, to make sure that we are in this for the long haul. So with that, Greg, I will pass it back to you.
Cool, thank you, Matt. I want to get Conan Harris in the conversation. You've been duly introduced by your wife, and so I want to thank you for being in this conversation today. A couple questions for you. As someone who has worked in philanthropy, both as a staff member and as a consultant, and has had some experience around this, the notion of re-entry, how do you think the folks on this call, the folks in philanthropy, can be more proactive partners in the re-entry work from your perspective?
Hello. First, I just want to say thank you to Congresswoman Presley and Congresswoman Bass, my chairwoman, and big shout out to the Liberty Hill Foundation, who's been a partner in bringing us all together. One of the things I just want to say to foundations as a former employee of the Boston Foundation is that, one, it's okay to not know all the answers. I think that is a lot of times when you're looking at work that deals with community, especially if you don't have the staff power to be in the space to know exactly the issues that you're looking to serve, it's okay to not know the answer. I think that one of the things that was huge and part of the conversation throughout is the people closest to the pain should be the closest to the power. And I think that is so important and crucial, and not a hashtag, but should be most important and centered in the work that we do. I think that I saw when we got it right at the Boston Foundations, when we brought in the folks from community to really talk about what needs to be done and how it needs to be done, and letting the folks from the community drive the conversation that will actually drive the funding. As a consultant years later, the foundation was going through a strategic planning process, and they brought me in to, again, center the voice of the people. I think that foundations is okay to not know the answers, but bring in folks who do. Bring in folks, considerate folks who do and does the work in community every day. I think that once you center the voice of the people, you can't go wrong.
Conan, any additional advice for folks on this call? Any recommendations you have in this time about next steps? And I have to believe that you get this conversation every day.
Yes.
Like, you live with someone who works on these issues, who cares about these issues. So I'm just curious, like, from your perspective, if you could say back to folks again, and building on what you've already said, what other recommendations, other than listening to folks who are on the ground, listening to folks who are most affected by said issues, and accepting that you don't know all the answers? Anything else that you think that folks should be doing after today's call?
One of the things that I did when I left government as the former Deputy Director of Public Safety and the head of my brother's keeper for the local chapter in Boston is I created my own consulting firm. And the reason why is because I saw little different sectors of work and some of the struggles that existed with being able to engage community and be able to send a community voice. And what I would say to philanthropy that's on the phone is that tagline some consultants that can help you think through your process. Because I think that a lot of times we try to figure out all the answers in-house when we do not know the answer. And sometimes we get it wrong, and it never citizens the work of community. So I would also ask our philanthropic partners is to bring in consultants that have a pulse on the work that you're seeking to serve. Bring in folks that know the work that you're trying to do. And also what I would say is that you heard from 2 national organizations on this call. Talk to them, engage them, figure out what the process has been, figure out what work that is, what are they doing, how are they serving the people best. Right now, you have a blueprint of folks that will open up their doors and engage you. And one of the last things I'll say is that right now, everybody's excited about the possibility of change, doing great hashtags and wanting to fund this work. I think that in the short term, you can literally look at local efforts that are engaging and do this work, but to stay in it consistently and for the long term, you have to attach yourself to an agenda, bring your organization through a strategic plan on what we need to be doing in the long term, because this can't just be a phase. This has to be the commitment for long term.
Excellent. Conan, thank you so much. Commitment, but hang out with us as long as you can. I've got want to bring Andrea and James back and Congresswoman Bass back into the conversation. So the first question I have is this was provided, and again, we received questions from folks in philanthropy who are on this call, and we're doing our best to get as many questions in as possible. So I'm going to ask you to be brilliant and brief in your responses so we can get as many of these questions out on the table. First question I have is for Andrea, or Andrea. Hope I got it right. So de-institutionalization was disastrous for Black folks and Indigenous folks and other people of color in the 80s and 90s when doors of mental health institutions opened up and it created a lot of more homelessness and other issues in our communities. What can be done to ensure that communities thrive right now? When we say folks are re-entering the community, Andrea, you talked about some of the needs around women in terms of jobs and economic development and entrepreneurship. What else would you recommend to this group in terms of helping folks move into back into society? Andrea, hold on 1 second. You need to unmute yourself.
Myself.
You said something brilliant, but we missed it.
Right. So we certainly did lose a lot during that period of time. And certainly anybody who has ever lived and navigated life while living in a prison understands the vast number of people who are currently incarcerated in this country who are struggling and suffering from trauma, mental health issues, things that people should never, ever, ever be in the environment of a prison. It will never help them to address those issues. One of the things that we also lost was control in community-led organizations that were close in the communities, hyper-locally, of where the people lived that were struggling with the trauma in relation to being cash poor, to the trauma of unaddressed mental health issues, to the trauma of substance use disorders. And after that period of time, when there was a shift to putting people in prisons, the remaining resources were placed into only state and local municipal led programs. And for us that are community organizers, for people who are on the ground, for people who live in the same communities that we work in, and have family members and loved ones who are entangled in these different systems, we know that you have to do more than just funnel resources through down from feds to state to city government and those entities that work within those structures. You also have to make significant investment and create the structures that allow for intermediaries to control money, to control funding that is put out and led, and the decisions being made about how to spend that money that is being led by intermediaries that are in the community, led by the people most directly affected. And people have to trust. People have to trust. And look at organizations like ours that has the capacity and has the accountability and has demonstrated that we can manage this type of, as an intermediary, to get the dollars into the places that we know are working in our communities and that we need to replicate 100-fold to really get to the root of what's happening now.
Cool. Thank you, Andrea. This next question is for Congresswoman Bass. We know that there's a lot of community-based organizations that are supporting people coming home early as a result of the rapid spread of COVID, and you spoke to that issue in your opening comments. This is a three-part sort of question, and you can hit them as quickly as you can, because again, we want to get as much of this out as we can. Number one, from your perspective, how reliable is the data on the numbers of COVID, contracted COVID cases in our prisons and jails? Number two, how can philanthropy and Congress work together to support, those returning citizens? And is there any opportunity for federal funding for states for these populations to ensure that reentry doesn't become a public health issue in and of itself? I know here in Alameda County, when 300 people were released from Santa Rita jail, many of us were happy to have folks come home, but we also knew that sheltering in place in that situation was going to be difficult, if not impossible. So from your perspective, how would you respond to those questions?
Okay, so the three things in terms of COVID data are totally unreliable. We have no sense at all. Every institution is inconsistent. I visited an institution in my area where they were testing 100% of the inmates and they were testing them regularly, but they weren't testing the staff, the people who come in and out. Now, they've locked the prisoners down so they don't have visitors, so the only way they could transmit it would be the staff. We are calling for people to be released, but we want people to be tested before they come home, because you know they're coming home to the very communities where there's a disproportionate rate. And so what this one institution was doing was testing and then quarantining people 14 days before they got out, which I think is a good thing to do. That way it didn't hold them up. They were able to get out, but for those folks that needed to be treated, they could also be treated before they got out. In terms of philanthropy and Congress working together, the best way for that would be for philanthropy to support our cry as members of Congress, because again, for most of my colleagues, they just, again, everybody understands a nursing home. I don't know why you can't understand a prison is obviously 10 times as intense as a nursing home. So providing us presentations and briefings and hearings and all, I think is the best way. Is there federal funding? I believe that there can be, but we take too long. And my concern is that the organizations need to be funded now. They need to be funded now because we won't be able to give grants to community-based organizations for COVID right now. And then the community-based organizations can't take advantage of the federal resources that are there because of the ban. And unfortunately, we fought that fight, but we lost it. So I'm hoping that philanthropy can fill in until we can pass legislation. I have specific legislation that I'm working on for reentry programs, and I've constructed the legislation in a way that I don't want it to go to probation. I don't want it to go to local government. I want it to go to grassroots organizations who are doing the work. But we take too long. And so I'm just hoping that philanthropy can be there while I'm going to continue fighting, but it might take me the rest of this year, or it might take me a new president that we have to have in the next 140 plus days. And I do want everybody to keep that on their mind too. If anybody is confused, this election is a life and death matter now. 118,000 Americans died, and this man has not missed a beat. I don't think he cares, and he's obviously decided to go with a herd immunity response, which is why he's acting like the virus doesn't exist anymore, because he's decided to accept, well, the people that are dying are old and they have all these other health conditions. And he's actually publicly said that. Yeah. So we need help, we need it now, and government takes too long.
Cool. Thank you so much. And I realize you're going to have to leave soon, but thank you for being here with us today. That's this question for James Anderson. How can investors and private sector actors be supportive in this conversation, in this work, not in the conversation, in the work? Thanks, James.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. You know, I definitely think it always comes back down to action, right? And what are the actions that people can take? You know, as Congressmember Karen Bass says, the government does take a while. You know, it takes a cohesive network of all of us coming together to really push change. But what we can do is we need to bring people to the table from the nonprofit sector, from philanthropy, and from business to really figure out what it is that each other needs in order to push this conversation forward. For me, that's the only way we're going to really make true change, because you know, we talk about closing these prisons, but people have to come back home. And if they come back home to what originally sent them there in the first place, you know, we're really just recreating a cycle. So we need to provide people opportunities to really build a new life. Another section is, you know, I think philanthropy, it falls into the same fault of focusing on specific cities like Los Angeles and New York. And we really need to start having a conversation of how we can focus on this, not in isolated regions, not in major cities, but actually as a huge network. A lot of people travel through states. What we're seeing is a lot of gaps where people are really being left behind. The last point is, you know, we keep hearing this, bring in experts with lived experience. I'll tell you this, I've sat at tables where I brought in as an expert and I can advise, and then everybody, the people that were empowered prior, go and take action, and things have not worked out well. I've been in positions like my last position where I was given full authority or a significant amount of power to make these decisions, to see it from the beginning to the end, and truly see some real impact being made. So I do ask that as we bring in these individuals that have this lived experience, to make sure that they're there from the process from the beginning to the end, not simply just serving as talking points.
Cool. James, thank you so much. I'm going to go back to Shane Goldsmith. We're almost at time, but Shane is going to share with us some ideas about opportunities to collaborate. And we really want to thank Andrea James Anderson, Congresswoman Presley and Bass for their conversation today. But Shane.
Hi. Again, thank you so much, Greg, for leading us today, and to all of our incredible panelists and speakers and moderators, and to all of you for joining us today for this truly phenomenal conversation. I think so many brilliant, beautiful things were said. I will not repeat them all, but I think that one of the key themes is that the people closest to the pain need to be the ones closest to the power. And I think we are all united in our work to accomplish that. So what can we do as funders? Number one, and we've heard this loud and clear from so many of our grantees and partners, increase your giving to Black-led organizations focused on justice and power building. That is number one. Increase your giving to Black-led organizations. Number two, join a funder affinity group to learn more and develop collective strategies. There's several, certainly the ones co-hosting this call include California Funders for Boys and Men of Color, the Executive Alliance, and Justice Funders. Contribute to pooled funds that focus on racial justice. At Liberty Hill, we have Our Kids, Our Future, which is fighting to end youth incarceration as we know it. And the Neighborhood Funders Group has a list of COVID-19 funds, including the Movement for Black Lives Mutual Aid Fund and National Bailout Fund. We will follow up with participants today with specific links and ways to get involved via email. Thank you again to our tremendous folks who spoke today, and especially to our co-hosts and to Representatives Karen Bass and Ayanna Presley. Thank you all for joining us. Take care.